The greatest dangers are rarely the cataclysms we see coming. They are the insidious cures we embrace to avoid them. We are told a chilling story about the United States government, a story of a gargantuan $36 trillion national debt, a ticking time bomb set to detonate the global financial system. We hear about a mathematical certainty, a death spiral from which there is no escape. The narrative paints a picture of imminent collapse, a crisis that will dwarf all previous financial calamities. But this story, as terrifying as it is, might be a grand misdirection. Here on Us Financial Market Dynamics, we invite you to listen to the story and join us as we analyze and decode every specific detail, asking the most crucial question: what if the collapse everyone fears is not the real threat? What if the real danger lies in the very mechanisms designed to prevent it? The conventional narrative presents a clear and terrifying argument. The United States government is trapped. Its debt has ballooned to over $36 trillion, a figure so immense it defies human comprehension. The interest payments alone now exceed the nation's entire defense budget, growing at an exponential rate. Every proposed solution, we are told, is a trap. Austerity or cutting spending would trigger a catastrophic recession, shrinking the economy and paradoxically worsening the debt-to-GDP ratio, as seen in the tragic case of Greece. Raising taxes would choke off investment and consumer spending, leading to the same recessionary outcome. And printing money to inflate away the debt would destroy the currency, leading to hyperinflation and social chaos. The conclusion is stark and seemingly inescapable. A sovereign debt crisis is not a matter of if, but when. However, this entire framework rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of power and fear in the modern global economy. Let's apply a reverse-thinking analysis to this doomsday scenario. The story we're told is one of hubris and blindness, of leaders sleepwalking into disaster. But what if the opposite is true? What if global policymakers are not blind, but are instead haunted by the ghosts of past collapses? The Great Depression of 1929 and the global financial crisis of 2008 were not just economic events. They were traumatic lessons etched into the DNA of every central banker and finance minister. The primary lesson learned was that a systemic collapse, a deflationary debt spiral where assets vaporize and banks fail, is the ultimate evil, to be avoided at any and all costs. Therefore, the very premise that the system will be allowed to simply implode under its own weight is flawed. The argument that austerity is a trap that triggers depression is presented as a reason the crisis is inevitable. But in reverse, it is the very reason why genuine, painful austerity will never be implemented on the scale required. No democratic government can politically survive inflicting a 25% contraction in its economy. The fear of that outcome paralyzes any meaningful attempt at fiscal discipline. We are not heading toward a Greek-style austerity crisis because the fear of that crisis is precisely what ensures we will continue to borrow and spend. Now, let's look at the argument that foreign creditors, like China and Japan, will eventually lose faith and dump their holdings of U.S. debt, triggering the final crisis. This paints a picture of independent actors making rational decisions to protect their assets. But is that the reality? Consider the alternative. These nations are not just creditors. They are deeply intertwined stakeholders in the system they supposedly threaten. If China were to liquidate its nearly $800 billion in treasury bonds, it would cause the price of those bonds to plummet. This would not only vaporize the value of their remaining holdings, but would also cause the U.S. dollar to crash. A crashing dollar would make Chinese exports to its largest customer, the United States, prohibitively expensive, crippling its own manufacturing sector and potentially causing mass unemployment. They are not holding a gun to America's head. They are locked in a form of mutually assured financial destruction. They cannot trigger the collapse without inflicting unacceptable damage upon themselves. They are not free agents. They are prisoners of the very system they helped build. This transforms the dynamic from a simple creditor-debtor relationship into a complex hostage situation where every party is incentivized to keep the system lurching forward, no matter how unstable it becomes. The narrative of an inevitable collapse fails to account for this global paralysis born of extreme fear. The real story is not about an impending explosion. It is about the extraordinary and increasingly desperate measures being taken to prevent that explosion. The true question is not what if the system will collapse, but what is the long-term price of ensuring it doesn't. This leads us to the most misunderstood piece of the puzzle. Inflation. The standard narrative presents inflation as a policy failure, a destructive force that spirals out of control and wrecks economies. But what if sustained, elevated inflation is not the accident? What if it is the plan? From a government's perspective, trapped with an unpayable mountain of debt, a sudden, outright default is political suicide and triggers immediate global chaos. A deep, deflationary depression is equally unacceptable. What is the third option? A silent default. This is a default that is never officially announced, one that happens slowly, almost invisibly, over years or even decades. This silent default is inflation. By creating more currency, the government can service its debts with devalued dollars. The nominal value of the debt, $36 trillion, remains the same, but its real value, its purchasing power, is steadily eroded. It is a massive surreptitious transfer of wealth. It moves wealth from anyone who saves in the currency, pensioners, wage earners, diligent savers, to the largest debtor of all, the government itself. This isn't a theory. It is a historical strategy. This is precisely how the United States shed its massive debt burden after World War II. It did not pay it back in the conventional sense. It held nominal debt levels relatively steady while growing the economy, and crucially, allowing inflation to run at an average of 4 or 5% for years, systematically diminishing the real weight of the debt. The argument that today's inflation would have to be far more extreme, perhaps 10-15% for a decade, and that this would trigger a crisis of confidence and spiking interest rates, is a valid concern. However, it overlooks the powerful tools of financial repression that governments can and will deploy. Financial repression involves forcing domestic institutions to hold government debt at artificially low interest rates. Pension funds, insurance companies, and banks can be regulated to require them to buy and hold treasury bonds, even if those bonds offer a negative real return after inflation. This creates a captive market for government debt, allowing the authorities to finance deficits and inflate away the debt burden without causing interest rates to spiral out of control. Out of control. We are already seeing the early stages of this. The Federal Reserve's massive balance sheet is a form of financial repression. When the central bank buys trillions in government bonds, it is artificially suppressing interest rates and financing the government's spending. The slow march towards central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, could be the ultimate tool of financial repression, allowing for direct control over savings and spending, and the implementation of negative interest rates. So, the death spiral is real, but it may not be a spiral towards a sudden fiery crash. It is a spiral into a managed decline. A spiral into a world where your savings are systematically devalued, where your investment choices are constrained, and where the economy is locked in a state of low growth or stagflation, because capital is constantly being diverted to service unproductive debt rather than fuel innovation. The doomsday scenario of a 2008-style crisis, amplified 100-fold, is a powerful and frightening image. It envisions a moment, a day, a week, where everything breaks, but the reverse-thinking perspective reveals a potentially more unsettling truth. The climax of this crisis may not be a single event at all. The new truth is that the collapse is not a future possibility. It is a present, ongoing process. The spectacular crash is being avoided. In its place, we are experiencing a slow, grinding demolition of wealth and economic freedom. The crisis isn't the banking system freezing. It's the fact that the money in your bank account buys 5% less this year than it did last year, and will buy less again next year, year after year. The crisis isn't mass unemployment in a deep depression. It's the rise of a generation that cannot afford to buy a home, start a family, or save for a meaningful retirement, despite being fully employed. Wealth is not vanishing in a stock market crash as it did in 1929. Instead, it is being transferred. It's transferred from the real economy of wages and savings to the financialized economy of asset prices, inflated by central bank liquidity. This is why we see stock markets hitting all-time highs while public satisfaction with the economy is at all-time lows. The numbers on the screen look good, but the reality on the ground feels broken. This is the endgame, not a sudden dramatic default, but a perpetual state of crisis management. The government can never pay back the debt, but it also cannot be allowed to default. Therefore, the central bank is forced into the position of being the permanent buyer of last resort, effectively monetizing the debt forever. This ensures the government can function, the banks remain solvent, and a systemic collapse is averted. But the cost is the destruction of the currency as a store of value and the zombification of the economy. Zombie companies, which are only able to service the interest on their debt, but can never pay back the principal, are kept alive by artificially low interest rates, preventing the creative destruction necessary for a healthy economy. The result is not a depression, but a great stagnation. A future that looks more like Japan's lost decades than America's Great Depression. This is the ironic, dark victory. The policymakers will declare success because the banking system did not collapse. The headlines will never read America defaults, but the reality for the average citizen will be a quiet erosion of their standard of living, a feeling of running faster and faster just to stay in the same place. The system doesn't crash. It just slowly suffocates the prosperity it was designed to create. The fear of the abyss has led us to build a gilded cage around it, and we are now locking ourselves inside. And so in the end, the story we must confront is not about a spectacular financial explosion that everyone is bracing for. It is about the silent, creeping fire of currency debasement that is already burning through the foundations of our prosperity. The choice was never between fiscal responsibility and collapse. The choice was between a fast, chaotic collapse and a slow, controlled one. And the authorities have made their choice. They have chosen to sacrifice the future value of our money to preserve the nominal stability of the system today. The debt spiral does not end with a bang, but with the quiet hum of the printing press, running day and night forever. This video analyzes historical economic cycles and current indicators for educational purposes, not financial investment advice. Please consult a professional before making investment decisions. If you enjoyed listening to the story, please press like, share this video, and leave a comment with your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the US Financial Market Dynamics channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos.